epistemic power. And so, yeah, so it's interesting that, even Kaiser, you're kind of, even these like ideal criteria cannot be met fully by anyone. And you have this long list of interests from the top to the bottom that you got to include: what atheist, agnostic, theist, basic understanding of every branch of science, understands logical fallacies, understands cognitive biases, right? Making a long list of a kind of like what, right? I guess Plato would have been like, oh, only the philosopher kings understand, right? All of these issues about understanding what is logic, right? The full kind of current knowledge of what is science, right? And even a lot of the forms of the technocrats would even argue this, right? They're like, well, the technocrats are the ones who have the most, or they meet all the criteria that you would say, right, that the technocrats would say is rationality, right? And rationality is already defined by the technocrats themselves. And so again, in a ideal true democracy, it could be argued that the democracy would also have to be able to define the very criteria of rationality itself, right? But how do you do that, right? Without presupposing some type of rationality. And that's why even this kind of conversation about what defines good governance, right, even presupposes even a discussion about democracy. Let's see. Anything else? Yeah, Trevor, you're mentioning something about like a knowledge about like the physical sciences, right? Would that be a criteria? Is that like, well, the reason that we understand what is good governance is because we've done a lot of scientific research, right? And we understand what is human nature, what all the biological sciences say, and then combine that with the soft sciences, and then now we have a better understanding about what people actually want, what drives people in actuality, and then we predetermine a goal, right? Therefore, our goal is still harmony, right? Or our goal is still compliance with the law that already exists, so that we maintain the populace at a status quo, stable level. Again, it always just kind of seems like we're getting to this vicious cycle about what precisely democracy is trying to determine based upon, right, a set of either criteria for rationality, but also the very idea of epistemology and knowledge, right? That knowledge itself kind of predetermines what it is that we in a democracy want, right? What is our goal based upon the knowledge that we have about human behavior or about, right, the very needs of human beings and so forth. Yeah, Victor, you want to jump in, or Brenda has her hand up?
Yeah, I was going to let Brenda.
Okay.
Brenda speak.
So I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to say something regarding what Victor mentioned a while back when he said that no one chooses an autocracy. So perhaps there are a few who would, maybe because they're so frustrated with democracy. But what we haven't talked about yet, I mean, all this conversation we're having to me is very lofty and very idealistic. It's just like writing another republic or whatever, like how should government be on a very theoretical, from a very theoretical framework. But maybe what should be looked at is how do democracies fail? Because as Aristotle pointed out, when they fail, then by default, they go to an autocracy. So how is our democracy? Is our democracy doing well, or is it failing? I look at two indicators. One, our presidents have been using more and more executive orders over the last decades, meaning that Congress is not doing its legislative job as it should be. And secondly, the vote on Supreme Court justices over the last 40 or 50 years, where it used to be 96 to 2 or 3 or whatever, and now it's strictly along party lines. To me, those are indicators that our democracy is not working. So if we want to talk about democracy, rather than going to theoretical, lofty viewpoints, it seems to me we should be looking at our own democracy. Is it succeeding? Is it failing? How is it succeeding? How is it failing? I think that's the best indicator of what a democracy should be.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Actually, we are going to get to those specific things. This is why this is going to last for 2-3 months. I wanted to start with the foundational ideas that first of all, because what do we mean by democracy? Yes, it is a lofty, abstract idea, but when we start evaluating the real democracies out there, we need to refer back to what it is that we're trying to achieve. And that's why I wanted to get to talk about these abstract ideas of what is democracy. Because at the very end of this discussion, to give you a preview, we're going to be discussing a theory of redesigning what we nowadays call electoral representative democracy, and completely radically changing it so that we drop out elections altogether. And there's a very powerful argument for why we should dump the US Congress altogether. And that's pretty radical, right? Well, why would anyone think about doing that? Well, part of it is what you just said, Brenda, because the existing system is broken and broken beyond repair. And it's a pretty serious claim. Before we defend that claim, we need to start at the very beginning and say, what do we mean by democracy? What do we mean by representation? What do we mean by elections? What role are they supposed to be doing? And if we're going to say later that the whole system is broken beyond repair, we need to replace it, like do surgery, political surgery on a major scale. It's not treatment. Some kind of physical therapy isn't going to work. That's where we're going. And that's why I wanted to start with these basic fundamental ideas so that we could later refer back to them if we get lost in the muddy reality that's out there. But we're going to get into that. So thanks for bringing it up, but we're going there, Brenda. Does anybody else have anything to say at this point? Go ahead. Right now. All right.
Terry, do you have your hand up?
Terry, go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, just briefly, listening to Brenda's comments and Victor, your follow-up, it brings to my mind Charles Sanders Peirce is like a linchpin or a cornerstone of my philosophical thinking, being an American. Semiotics, but especially his pragmatism. And I may be oversimplifying, but I take his pragmatic maxim, which Dewey and James subsequently just corrupted to the nth degree, but be that as it may, his original intent, I think, was to say nothing more than from a pragmatic, practical perspective. Everything you think you know comes down to what you're willing to act upon. And to me, that's an extremely salient, practical guiding star, if you will. I'm not going to act on something I don't believe to be true. I'm only going to act on things that I do believe to be true. And when you take acting on what we believe to be true into account, now we run into a huge logical problem scientifically. What's the lingua franca of science today? It's math, right? Mathematics, all the maths, all the algebras, all the calculi, all the geometries, etc. I prefer the complex number system, but that's just one sidebar. With that pragmatic maxim in mind, there are at least two logical dimensions here that are at play. One is the epistemic, what's the ideal logic for rational knowledge, let's say. And then on the other hand, what's the ideal deontic logic? The one that tells us what to act upon, what steps to take. And if you take science as an epistemic pinnacle, if not an ideal, and you take acting on what you best know from a rational perspective, those two types of logics, those two types of categories of logic, if you will, become the bone and the marrow, to use a metaphor, of the political will and the political body, for me. And I'm not saying clear, as I listen to myself, I'm not being clear about what I mean to get across, but it's that pragmatic maxim from Peirce, for me, that Brenda's comments kind of piqued my thinking. And I think the deontic aspects of it and the rational aspects of it are a logical labyrinth. Anyway, I just wanted to add that to the flow.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Terry. And also thanks again, Brenda. I think you raised some good points. We're going to try to go there eventually. Does anybody else have anything to say at this point? Okay. I want to, before we get off, move from democracy, there's one point that we should discuss, and that is the kinds of democracy out there. If we believe that democracy is some kind of desirable form of doing governance, there's more than one kind. An argument can be made that democracy, the pure democracy, is direct democracy. Direct democracy is when everybody votes on everything. No cut out the representatives, cut out the senators, cut out everybody else. Maybe even the president. We want to go to war. We have an instant. We can go online and click on a button. Should we go to war? And we decide instantly. We could technologically, that's maybe possible these days. It wasn't back 2 centuries ago, but to get every single citizen of this country who's interested to vote on every single issue of the government. This is direct democracy. Some people are suggesting that that's theoretically possible now. It wasn't. Is that desirable? If that could be done, would that be a better system than, say, a system we have now? Does anybody have any thoughts about that? If it were possible. I mean, there are arguments against too, but well, one argument against it would be that can you really trust everybody out there to really make the right decision just by clicking, going online? Let's say we wanted to solve at a national level whether to solve the abortion problem and make whether it's legal on a national level, whether having an abortion. And we simply said, okay, it's 6 o'clock on Wednesday evening, everybody get online and click yes, no. And then by a few minutes later, we know the answer, and that would be the law of the land until we changed it. If we could change laws that quickly, would that be desirable? Or decide to go to war, or any other issue that you can think of that. One of the concerns people would have with that is that I'm not sure if the concern is, I'm not sure what to make of the concern, because on the one hand, it seems inconsistent. Is there a fear that you need we need leaders. We need somebody to intervene between us and decisions, someone to deliberate, and that we need some go-between, someone to literally slow the process down, because if such major decisions could be made so quickly, we might make bad decisions if we just rely on the straw polls, because people in general, on the whole, can you trust popular opinion? Because that's what it would be to make such important decisions. Don't you need some intelligent go-between, some intermediary that is sort of helping to screen the crazy ideas from the impractical ones and so on? But if it really is good governance by the governed is everybody out there. It's not the senators and representatives, it's the rest of us. If we're the ones that are supposed to be governing in a democracy, then it seems like, at least unless someone comes up with a good reason not to, that something like that would be ideal. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? About direct democracy, if it were possible?
Yeah, Mike has his hand up.
Mike, go ahead.
Well, I just something that came to mind to think about is that in watching some interviews of Russians, they were asked the question, should we have gone to war? And some of them say, and it's hard to know how accurate this is, because they may be afraid of speaking out, but a lot of them said, well, if Vladimir Putin made that decision, then it was therefore the correct decision to make. I saw that more than once. I just think it's something to think about.
Yeah. Well, does anybody think it would be a good idea if it was technologically possible, and some say it is, that we could have direct democracy nowadays? Or would it be a bad idea? Anybody have any thoughts about it? And my thought is that you really do have to have faith that most people know that what they want and would that what most people want is what should be the case. But that means you have to believe in democracy really seriously.
Trevor has his hand
Yeah,
up.
go ahead, Trevor.
I think it'd be a good idea to just observe what works in other domains, like in science or in finance or corporations. In a corporation, if you have an old system that's kind of getting to the end of its lifespan, typically you'll develop a new system and run it in parallel, but without hooking it up to the control systems. It's basically just reading input data and outputting predictions, and then you can compare the two systems. In a corporation, typically there's a particular necessary outcome. Democracy is different in this regard, but you could run a parallel direct democracy system. You could run it for a decade or 2 decades and see what it produces and continue refining it. And then at some point you could either switch over, or you could just use it to supplement the current system. Or, reality being as it is, you wouldn't even have to turn any power over to it, because it would influence the people who are currently in power. Because once the population started to become aware of, once the population had greater ontological awareness of what politics is actually composed of, as opposed to what we're told it is composed of in the questionably accurate media, the gig would kind of be up for politicians, and they'd have to clean up their act eventually, because they know they've got, a couple hundred well-coordinated minds that are constantly being upgraded from their current constant delusional state. And this system would constantly be improving itself on a daily basis, whereas democracy as it is essentially static. It never changes, and it runs largely on deceit. Whereas if you had a competing platform where deceit was targeted and eliminated as a matter of principle, I can't see how it wouldn't very quickly be many orders of magnitude more powerful than traditional democracy.
What is the control system that you're referring to? So again, if you have an example of a few either corporations or a few revolutionary groups, right, that are testing out a particular, let's just say Marxists, right? Actually, Marxists actually would say exactly that. You'd be like, this is one way in order to, right, unveil the cloud, right, of what the bourgeois have put over the proletariats, right, in terms of what is the actual real material conditions of the actual world, right? So I guess Marx would then had said that the materialist conditions is the real control group, right? But then that still is itself an ideology, and so every control group itself would be an ideology. So what would then be the quote unquote objective control group, I guess, would be the one way of socially criticizing, right, even this view.
I think it depends how you do it. Like in software, there's even in software, there's ideologies.
Sure.
However, there are some things that are not ideological. For example, if you write code that is not valid, the compiler will often tell you. If you write code that is valid but incorrect, your unit tests will tell you, or you will produce values that are detectable as incorrect. A lot of politics is largely composed of conversation and ideas. It is possible to critique ideas and conversation and point out places that are objectively incorrect. Now, some things are subjective, and you can't resolve that to a correct answer, but you can label it as such. Very often, subjectivity, very often beliefs are presented and believed to be factual, um, opinions and facts are presented as being the same, and there's nothing that's, and if you know, it's kind of even worse than it seems, because in the case where some people do try and apply epistemic rigor to political claims, humanity is filled with all of these kind of viruses running in people's brains, where if someone critiques something validly, that is not allowed into the brain because of all of these processes running that will identify the valid critique as being a conspiracy theory, or not being discussed in good faith, or what else? There's this meme involving a walrus where you're just asking questions. So the very act of asking questions, which is a correct behavior, it has been socially programmed into people to be wrong. So it's like people's minds have been programmed to behave in the opposite of how they should. So the question is, now you might reject this because, well, that would be a conspiracy, and conspiracy are not possible. But it's also possible through emergence. So you don't even need any nefarious actors in the system. You can get suboptimality can simply arise as an emergent phenomenon out of complex systems. So, you know, if you actually take a fine-tooth comb, and if you don't allow yourself to be discouraged by claims of pedanticness, right? That's another thing, is if you think too carefully, people will call you pedantic, right? So it's almost like we've designed the system and our cognition to produce bad results and be in, you know, to serve people who are governing poorly, speaking untruthfully, and so on and so forth. These things could be dealt with. I mean, it's a big job, but if you decompose it into kind of discrete functions, I don't think it's really all that hard.
Okay. Thanks, Trevor. Brenda, you have your hand up?
I just wanted to again answer to Victor's question about the possibilities of direct voting. And so George Washington wanted to have people, of course, have a say in their government, but he was very aware that you don't want them to have too much of a say, because they will simply vote for what's good for them only. They will have a very myopic view of their voting. And, you know, originally the Senate was not directly elected by the people. That came with an amendment somewhere down the line. The senators were chosen from the state legislatures, and they were meant to be them sending their best to that body. So I think that's the danger of direct voting. That's what you were asking us to provide input for, is what were the dangers of direct voting? And I think it's pretty much what George Washington was saying, that people will simply vote for what's the best for them, and they will not have in their viewpoint the common good. I wonder too, whether there should almost be some sort of a test that people have to take to have the right to vote. I think it's kind of a crazy thing that, you know, just because you're born in the United States, you can vote and you don't know a darn thing, but you can vote. So maybe some sort of a test about understanding how our government works before people are allowed to vote might help.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brenda. Actually, you say that if people, I mean, yeah, you're repeating what said George Washington, and others have said too, that people will, if left to their own devices, they'll vote for what's good for them, but not for the common good. But isn't the common good defined by what most people want in a democracy? In other words, 90% of the electorate wants a certain policy or law passed. That is the common good. If 51% of the public wants it, isn't that the common? Or if it's not the public who's deciding what the common good is, then who is? Is it some special epistemic, you know, this aristocracy or something, or epistocracy, or technocrats, or oligarchy? Who is deciding what, if the two contrast with each other, what most people want and the common good, who should win? That's my question. Where does the common good, who decides that? Is that supposed to be self-evident or what? In a democracy, I mean. Now, I know that the common good is decided in an autocracy by the dictator or the king or whoever. They decide what the common good is. Or in an oligarchy by that class of people in power, that small class of people in power. But in a democracy, it is the people, what most people want, that is the common good. That's what I find a little puzzling there. Do you have any thoughts about that, Brenda? Or what do you think?
I don't know. I don't know if I quite agree with you that the definition of the common good is what most people want.
So
Most
what-
people, well, the
Yeah,
common good is generally considered to be when you look at all people and all problems and all situations, economic, social, and so forth, what would be the decision that would serve the most people? And I don't know if you can count on that voice being clearly coming from the individual vote. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, Victor. It's a very interesting question. But there's just a part of me that wants to resist saying that people would vote for what you consider to be the common good. Because I guess in my mind, I consider the common good to be somewhat more along Platonic lines, something above just what every selfish, greedy person would want.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not, that is a problem. And that's exactly, I think, the motivation behind Plato's idea. Plato thought that he had an idea of what the common good, that something that's bigger than the individual, that's about the well-being of everybody or the whole community. And he saw that as essentially something like harmony, or everybody getting along and working well together to each other's benefit. And he stipulated what the common good is. This is what it is. And he decided this. Not everybody, but he didn't arrive at that notion democratically by taking a straw vote of what most people want. But that's a problem, because if it's not the public, in a democracy, if it's not what the majority of people want that is equivalent with the common good, then what is the common good? Is it to be decided by this individual or this small group of people? I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm just asking the question. I mean, that's all. But yeah. Jamal, I think you have your hand up. Are you there? Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one is to piggyback a bit on Brenda's point of not Brenda's point, as of experts, the common good, like what determines or who would determine what common good is. And I think a lot of this presuppose a false sense of scarcity into the conversation itself. As in the material, like with the world we live in, we would have enough means and resources to like address all these needs and wants. But I think what's missing here is the underlying system people are living in, like that conversation democracy changes how you interact with the government, like how your material conditions changes your relationship with the government itself and how you view what's important or not. And I think the hesitation of some people here is that in giving everyone the freedom to vote, because nobody knows what you want or need better than yourself, like you know what's best for yourself. And if we're presupposing, as you mentioned earlier in the discussion, that democracy is important because every person has a rational being, capable of rational thought, and makes choices unto themselves. Ergo, we should do the best we can to make sure as many people are involved to make those choices for themselves. And I think that's what it is. It's to be okay with some people's choices. May not agree with you, or you may not agree with them, but part of it is that's their choice. Like you we may not agree, but that's the choice that or way they voted on. And so that's the thing that will go through. So if I'm wrong, but I think, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead. Did you, Vincent? Vincent, I think your mic is off.
Oh, can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yeah,
There we
now.
go. Yeah, just going back to the thread. Terry, you said something about maybe what the question was about. Epistemically, knowledge per se is a range spectrum or continuum across negative opposing strengths, convictions of one's belief, and contemporary scientific scientism, where maths established the lingua franca, something about Popper. Yeah, and I think yeah, you're again referring to, I think, a problem that has been definitely evident, even discussion about again, whether or not anybody knows what they actually want, whether or not representatives can achieve what is the common good, right? Again, the definition of what is the common good, unless it's just literally achieving the majority of what everybody's individual beliefs are. And if it's not that, then what is it? And that can be determined by, I guess, Terry, maybe you were suggesting there's some type of scientific realism that can be used to adjudicate perhaps the common good. So that also kind of stands as another kind of classic problem that goes back to the technocrats, right? The technocrats would then say that they have the most updated understanding of the scientific knowledge, and therefore they understand scientific realism better than anybody else, and therefore they should have maybe more of a vote so they can adjudicate the kind of the whims and wishes of the average person, because let's just say the majority happens to want to increase coal production that would, like say, raise the temperatures by 3 degrees 100 years faster. Therefore, we could be like, we're on the faster precipice of a global disaster, right? You'd be like, well, no, we don't want them to do that because we have the scientific knowledge that if we raise the temperature by 3 degrees in a matter of 10 years, right, it's going to basically kill everybody. In a catastrophic occurrence much sooner. Therefore, we should negate that majority view because we have some type of, again, scientific knowledge about the quote unquote objective reality of everyone's overall well-being in a utilitarian sense, right? I'm calculating your well-being because even though you might say like, oh, I don't care, I want to increase coal production because I want to have the best life I can in the next 5 years. I just want to party like it's 1999, right? But then of course the technocrats would say, well, no, that's not good for everybody because it's obvious that you want a longer life, right? So therefore it's an objective scientific truth, right? That human beings should value longer life versus shorter life, right? And therefore that becomes viewed as a scientific objective reality, right? Which I would argue that is not, right? It's a value normative laden thing that even if there is a truth to it, right? It can't be measured and it can't be, at least the discourse can't exist in the same type of, say, positivism or scientific realism that we can talk about the temperature and heat and those kinds of things, especially when we're talking about the values of human beings, right?
Yeah, if I may, yeah, I totally resonate with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be oversimple, but the prevailing moral and political ideal for a long time has been greatest good for the greatest number. That utilitarian pragmatism has been dominant since Peirce. When Dewey and James took Peirce apart and reconstructed it with a positivist orientation, which kind of took the heart out of it. And this just
Right.
but anyway.
At least in the Western tradition, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I limit most of what I have to say, especially in this event,
Right.
from the Western manifest destiny, white male supremacy context. Okay.
Right.
And where was I going with that? Oh, that utilitarian pragmatism, greatest good for the greatest number, I think has been a myth pretty much all along in Manifest Destiny. The greatest good for the most powerful has kind of replaced that in reality, I think. But the myth is still the story we tell ourselves. But I think, for instance, where I really wanted to go is scientific, genuinely rational scientific knowledge, okay? And that qualifier of genuinely rational is essential because not all science, so-called, is really fully rational, but that's a longer discussion. But genuinely rational scientific knowledge is necessary, but not sufficient for good governance, democracy, or any kind. For instance, we were talking about what is the commons. Well, I would take it to be almost self-evident, even though there might be some deniers, self-evident that the survival of the species and all of its specimens is probably a good idea to have in the commons of, what everyone ought to want. I want to survive as a human being. I want my family to survive as a human being. So there's my self-interest in that commons. And do I really want to murder everybody else so I can ensure that for my own? That would be pretty sociopathic and pathologically irrational. You see what I mean? So finding the proper role for the scientific participation in governance is essential. But I wouldn't, I'm a little skittish about weighting it, okay? Well, it's the pinnacle, the apex, the top knowledge that we're capable of achieving as our species. So it ought to weigh more heavily than, let's say, morality or ethics or sociology or philosophy. When you get into weighting one over the other, I think that's a pretty slippery slope.
Yeah, Jamal, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess one thing I think this common good, I think what the language does itself, it case, I think it'd be helpful to think of as a common need, like think of human needs rather than human good, as in what do people need? Food, shelter, healthcare, and if governance is to address people's needs, that will, one, make decisions based on whichever percent on part of us on science, and also to be ethical as well, addressing people's needs in that way or approaching it and framing decisions in that way will help a lot of I think would be the most useful way of framing. I think that'd be a easier way to get around this, deciding, hey, what's the common good, or who decides the common good? I think framing it or addressing to what our common needs or what our human needs, and coming from that point of view will highlight demystified decision making and highlight necessary needs and things like that. Yeah,
that is interesting, Jamal. I just want to jump in, and Victor has done some philosophy talks and work on this about even you could argue that if we're trying to codify or reframe something that might be like universal or essential, or whatever it is that you might want to use the word needs or wants, and right, and how to codify that, right? You might say that even like the history of human rights, right, was a mechanism, right, even though it's a brainchild of a bunch of white philosophers, right, that whether or not human rights can even be have its own real ontology, right? It could be some type of way in which the history of at least democratic forms have tried to codify those kind of fundamental universal, again, rights, instead of just like calling them like, oh yeah, you have the universal right to going skiing every winter, right? No, that's just, that's an elitist right to be able to go skiing or playing golf whenever you want to, right? So that doesn't make any sense that you can codify that as a universal human. Again, let's use the word need, right, instead of right, whatever that means. So like, say we have a universal human need for healthcare, as you said, right? That seems to be something that maybe over in the long span of democratic consensus, right, has come up with this essentially like, yeah, this is something that maybe we can try to encode right into the at least the legal structure. And no matter what the whims and wishes of the majority, quote unquote, common good might decide at any particular moment, right? Those particular universal foundations are encoded into that legal structure. And then whether or not that actually, right, itself is still considered legitimate because it was decided by whatever democratic form, right? So, well, that human right was decided by the consensus of majority, right? So who's to say then that that particular quote unquote universal right is in fact universal right? You know, obviously still has that kind of question begging issue that we're trying to uncover. So yeah, very interesting thoughts about that.
Yeah, does anybody else have any other comments about this? Yeah, getting back to the idea of direct democracy, I mean, one of the problems that people have put out, like, let's suppose that right after 9/11, like the next day, that we were, whether or not the country would go to war with somebody was put to a poll, to a vote, and large groups of people were lots of people were quite upset after that. And anyone pointed out, anyone who may have been remotely or even suspected of being responsible for 9/11 would have been seen as an enemy we should go get right away. You know, they were a bad actor without much thought, without much, in other words, it would be an immediate reaction. Well, we did, in fact, go attack some country, Afghanistan, and then, I mean, Iraq, and then Afghanistan, and 20 years later, things are not much better there than they were after having spent trillions of dollars there and countless lives lost. Was that decision even, you know, would the public as a whole have made a very wise decision if they had to make a decision immediately after an event like that, whether or not to go to war? Would they have made a very wise decision? Of course, you could say, well, the politicians who were in power at the time, who made that decision, reacted exactly the way we might think the majority of the American electorate would have wanted them to do. That is, to go kill somebody because somebody harmed us in a very serious way. Somebody's got to pay for this, and it doesn't really matter that much right now whether that entity, that government, that group of people who did this are the right ones. Just that somebody has to pay for this. I mean, it's that kind of knee-jerk reaction that can happen to individuals, but can also happen in entire societies, but even when it's mediated through representatives and leaders that are supposed to not just follow the people but lead them, it fails. I mean, bad decisions are made, whether it's your representative making them or whether it's the populace as a whole making them. So, you know, anyway, I think that's one concern that people had about direct democracy. But let me say something positive about direct democracy, not because it's going to work on a national scale, but because there is something about it that is lost in representative democracy, and we should be conscious of it. Let me read this. Okay, direct democracy, this is where everybody votes on everything. There's no intermediary between you and the outcome of the vote. Works best in small groups. It works, for example, it works great on the Supreme Court. You got 9 people, or in juries, 12 or 13 people, or a group of people the size of this club. If we were going to vote all those here on some issue, direct democracy would work great. We don't need to have representatives because you're interacting with all the others. So in other words, direct democracy works great in small groups, but it slowly degrades as it gets larger. And part of the reason it works reasonably well in small groups is because of something we could call epistemic intimacy. When you're in a group this small, we can actually get to, even if we were voting on something, all of us here right now, and we disagree with somebody else, you could at least hear that person out, listen to what they have to say. You may not agree with them, but at least you might understand where they're coming from and why they choose to vote the way they want to. This epistemic intimacy allows people to disagree with each other while still retaining the possibility of respect for the other person because they understand why because they heard them out. This becomes impossible at the scale of millions of people. And this leads to something called, there becomes there is something about direct democracy, especially direct democracy, that works great on a small scale, but it begins to degrade rapidly at the scale of large groups of people. Perhaps some have even argued that even at as few as 100 people. By the time you get to 100,000 people or 1 million, the meaning of democracy, as far as working well, is highly diluted to the point where it becomes it becomes less and less about expressing your view and more about some kind of social involvement, like wanting to be part of a block that's bigger than you, being part of something bigger than yourself, like you're on this team or that team. Because you can't be out there on the field playing by yourself. It's not one-on-one or a few on a few. It's billions against other groups of millions of people. And something is lost in that when you have to have an intermediary, a representative. And that's going to be where we pick up next time when the next meetup I want to do is going to focus on representation and the problems with it. And this is where we get into having elections and what's wrong with representation. And is there more than one kind of representation? We've been pretty much wedded in the Western world for a long time to electoral representation, where we vote for representatives who are supposed to reflect our views. But when you look closely at what is involved there, it becomes extremely problematic how representation works, at least of the electoral type we're talking about. And we'll get more into that next time. But anyway, I think I'll unless somebody has some final comments, go ahead. Who's next here?
Jamal, you had your hand up since last time, or do you still want to say something?
Jamal, do you want?
Oops, no, my bad.
Okay. Is it Terry and Vince?
Yeah, I'm going to put a link in the chat to some work by Charles Taylor on buffered versus porous selves. And to me, that's one of the social dynamics of our time, that buffering that we're mostly mired in and very little porosity at the social level. To me, that dynamic, that power structure is one of the major constraints, blocks, inhibitors to solving these kinds of problems, even having these kinds of discussions, is that divide between, living in these bubbles of isolated buffering from our next door neighbors, even, much less the community on the commons at large. Anyway, I'll put a link into that article for anyone who might be interested in following up on it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Go ahead, Vince. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Terry, for the comments. And yeah, Charles Taylor is great. So yeah, any other, there's a huge, obviously, slew of philosophers who have been tackling these problems for very, 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 very long time. I was saying to Victor at the beginning, I'm rereading Habermas right now, and maybe I can put a link to Habermas, and also Gadamer too. Again, this is more of the continental tradition, who is a little bit more about. And I was going to say this to Victor right before we started talking about, again, the comparative between direct democracy and so forth is like, yeah, what's missing in direct democracy is what is called deliberation, right? That if you don't, the essential ingredient, if you don't have any type of deliberation, you can't really call it any type of real democracy, or at least a consensus democracy. And so, many theorists, I guess, who've argued that with the internet, we've solved that problem with direct democracy, but that's total bullshit. Actually, it's caused more problems than anything. But yeah, there has to be, again, in that solution about, like, if we just went to a direct vote to decide what to do after 9/11, right? And if there was a way in which there was an ideal, true deliberative forum for millions and millions of Americans, right? That worked in the way in which even Victor talked about, that solved that intimacy problem, and the actual dialogic problem, then perhaps it could work. And I also posted a link in the forum that just dropped in the Scientific American, I guess, in November issue. And we'll talk about that in the next time, which is that, again, the difference between representative proxy democracy or representation and sampling representation. And so there are some examples of actual ad hoc assemblies, right, that are formed, and you basically take a sample of the population. And obviously there's some problems with that, which is number one, volunteers, unless it's like, forced, right? Which worked in the Greek. And there's even a talks about the Greek lottery system, right, that chooses juries, that chose even actual representatives in the old Greek democracy, which was like, oh, I'm a citizen. Well, again, if you are a citizen or were a citizen, right, you actually get called up to be part of that sampling, right? And of course, the problem that algorithms are now trying to solve is how do you make a true, fair sampling representation of any ad hoc assembly, right? And if you can solve that problem, then there are some arguments to be made that then you solve the problem, right, of a direct democracy in which you then take the sampling of that is the fairest representation of the actual population based upon whatever decided criteria about whatever gender, age, religious beliefs, whatever. And then that would then be the quote unquote true deliberative process. And again, it still goes back to that fundamental question that we can still continue to ask, right? So if you're still asking this hypothetical question, what if it went to a direct vote, again, for the example, after what happened in 9/11, what would be the criteria for you to decide whether or not it was or not a good decision, right? So even if someone said, well, we just decided, we put it to a vote, right? And the American population decided to drop nukes on both Afghanistan and Iraq, who's to say then how that turned out as a good or bad decision afterwards, right? You could be like, oh, that sounds crazy. It sounds like a nuclear holocaust, right? Be like, well, what value judgment are you using to then say whether or not democratically that was or was not the best or worst outcome based upon that decision? Because it's always based upon the very value system that it's being judged on of who made the decisions, right? So we're also solving that problem about how do we adjudicate, right? What is it that we are saying is going back to that good governance or the adjudication of the very value system that we're talking about. And I would argue that in a deliberative process, a true deliberative process, you could partially solve that problem, right? Because the very rational consensus that you come to itself is an adjudication of the very values that that you're judging on. And this is kind of a lot of Habermas kind of talks about that, about trying to solve that problem about how do you engage in a rational communicative act in deliberation that doesn't just beg the question that you're just making a decision based upon the very value system that the society particularly exists in. So great talk, everybody. I'm excited about the next one.
By the way, Vincent, you mentioned something that I am going to get to, the alternative, the plutocracy, choosing representation by a non-electoral means,
right,
is beginning to become a thing in political philosophy and other places. And there's some. Are you familiar with Alex Guerrero? Who's at Rutgers, I believe.
I've seen his name around. Yeah, maybe also just like from maybe you mentioned
he's a major advocate of this idea, and is
right.
Find him these lectures he has on YouTube if you want to check it out.
Yeah,
he's worked out a pretty elaborate system that is like that to get in conjunction with some other people. But yeah, we're moving toward discussing that at the end of this. But in order to make it, it's a pretty radical change from the way we do things now. And in order to make it plausible, that's part of the reason I'm going through these things, showing what is fundamentally wrong with the way we're doing things now, and can it be fixed? So there's two options: to fix the system we have now, or to do something radically different. And I'm sort of convinced that the current system is beyond repair, but we need to examine why that is. It's interesting to explore why that is, because anyway.
So the article in Scientific America, he's a computer scientist at Harvard or something like that. And he's solving the sampling problem based upon a purely volunteer group, right? Because obviously there's that also problem that like, if we could just force everyone to sign up for any type of, ad hoc deliberative assembly that we have about every, subject. Let's talk about what we want to do about climate change. Let's talk about what we want to do about, right, abortion, right? Let's form a ad hoc true sampling of the American populace and come to a deliberative assembly and let them pass a particular policy, right? But of course, it's like, yeah, like no one's who's going to volunteer, and obviously the who volunteers is itself, right? Probably already educated elites that we're trying to also sample
Right.
for and also out of, right?
Well, I think that the system that the autocratic system that Guerrero is suggesting is one where anybody, like the way juries are chosen, anybody could be randomly chosen from the public to be on these, what he calls single issue legislatures.
Yeah.
It'll be focused on one area of the government, like healthcare or defense or agriculture or education or whatever. And they will spend 3 years in office, so to speak. They would be elected. The first year would be largely educational, getting them up to speed on what they need to know about this particular area of public policy. Second, third year, they'd actually be making laws that would govern everybody in society. And in the third year, they'd be helping to train their replacements, and that would be it. Nobody could run for office. Nobody runs for elections. No campaigns. But you have, and the samples would be approximately, he says, about 300 people per sill. But
don't forget the part about how they'll be extremely well remunerated.
What did you say?
Don't forget the part about how they'll be extremely well remunerated.
Right. That's important. That's important because the point is that these people would have to have no excuse whatsoever to take money from anybody else, and they don't need to worry about being reelected. They're not going to be reelected.
Right.
They're there to serve for a specific period of time, and then somebody else comes.
And also, it's supposed to take into account their, keeping intact their normal careers and lives during that period.
Correct. Yeah, they just like in theory, it doesn't actually work this way in practice with jury duty because it's pretty lousy. But in theory, these people would, if they have to interrupt their lives to do this for 3 years, they would have firm guarantees that could recover, go back to what they were doing at the end of 3 years without any penalty here, because otherwise people wouldn't want to serve. No one would be forced to serve, by the way, but they would have the opportunity to serve, and they would be remunerated sufficiently that most people would say, this is not bad. I'm going to be paid well for my work. So at one point they were talking about $1 million a year. Okay, and most people would jump at the chance to serve at that rate. You get paid to, 3 years of that, and you could retire. But anyway, I don't think that's the number that they're talking about. I think they're getting a little bit more reasonable, but it's supposed to be a handsome amount to keep people from being corrupted.
But I think we pay our senators $1 million a year already, I think, in terms of cost.
What did you say?
I think we already pay our senators around that rate.
Yeah.
$1 million a year.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
I think it's still less technically, whatever the
I mean, including all the benefits, like they get.
Yeah. I think it's like with the healthcare, all the healthcare benefits, because I think isn't it still like 300,000 is I have to go back and look. Yeah. But probably added benefits, all the other probably stock perks, even though it's probably illegal, right? Somehow they're all rich, or somehow will be rich, right? Book deals and stuff.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
Terry.
but we could get a lot more work out of them if we just let the poor be involved for no pay at all, because they'll jump at the chance to have their voice heard.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Terry?
Yeah, the actual salary figures are 174,000 for senators and representatives. Now, when you throw in the special benefits they have, that probably at least triples or quadruples what their real benefits are, including that moderate salary. But
They kick that too.
actually,
Yeah.
I actually had a question, which is why I had my hand up. If you're familiar with Extinction Rebellion,
Yeah.
and how they framed their movement from the beginning, they wanted to adopt what they call citizens' assemblies And they would use a process of sortition, which is a kind of lottery, to draw people into those citizens' assemblies. They also had, now I'm taking the word citizen there to be literal. You would have to be a citizen of the country in order to be in the lottery to participate in a citizens' assembly. But they also had something else that was like a people's group that non-citizens could participate in. And the dynamic exchange between those two would shape what the citizens' assemblies would adopt as guiding principles of their governance, as it were. Now, that's Extinction Rebellion's take on what I think I understood you to be describing. Is that accurate?
I'm sorry.
If you're referring like, yeah, sortition is, yeah,
Yeah.
again, how you're doing a sampling, right?
Right,
And
right,
that's
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they're using Harvard's using algorithms to try to use a sortition process, even with the unfair sampling that they have, right? You have 100 people who are all educated, only 5 people who are don't have a whatever higher education. Then you have to then sort it that way, right? Because you can't then, it's more likely that you're going to get more people from the educated populace than the uneducated populace, but you want an exact, true sampling of the relationship with that sample to the actual population, right?
Right.
And that becomes the practical problem that they're trying to solve.
All right. Okay, Jamal, did you want to say something, or if not, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did you want to say
Yeah.
something?
Yeah, I guess part of it is I want to come back a little bit, like pay, like benefits for like public servants, and how I'm more of the side they should be paid minimum wage. So they would be forced to raise minimum wage, like, hey, no one can live off of this. So be actually reasonable on what day-to-day Americans live with or go by. And I think that, yeah, that one will help, like, once again, come back to address and just give them what gumption to be, remember, they're one of us. They're
Yeah.
not they're not as elite as they think they are. They're just regular people like us. Yeah.
And they're not as insulated from the reality of that most people have to live in.
Yeah. Because they still believe like that $2,000 helped out a lot. But anyway, conversation for another day.
Yeah, we will be discussing this eventually. This is where we're moving, but I feel I needed to go through these basic ideas first and talk about what's wrong, and because there are other proposals. One is just to fix the existing system, and there's some stumbling blocks to doing that, which we'll be talking about later, to fixing the existing system. So anyway, that's where we're going. Thanks everybody who came. It was a good conversation, I think. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks.